Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see everybody today. Glad you made it out on the chilly morning. It's a beautiful morning. And I think we're in for some more beauty this afternoon, from what I understand. Going to be a beautiful thing. I always love a good snow, and so I think I'm in for a good one today. I recognize I may be on the small list of people who is excited about that. Although, the children are definitely, indeed. The children are definitely excited. My boys are convinced there's not going to be school tomorrow, and so if they do have school, it's going to be quite a shock to their system to wake them up tomorrow morning and have them go, no. Glad you're here with us this morning. We are continuing our study through the Old Testament as we're looking at an overview of the Old Testament survey, but we have a specific lens through which we are examining these familiar stories of the Old Testament, and that is finding the connections to Christ in each one of these. Today we find ourselves in the opening section of the book of Exodus, as we're going to be looking at the deliverance from Egypt, the story of the deliverance of Egypt. Now, this is a rather lengthy passage that we're going to be jumping into today, and so it's going to necessitate us doing some jumping around to cover the story. We're going to be looking at the first section of the book of Exodus, about the first 12 chapters, and pulling out some different insights from those as we look at this section together. To get our minds going this morning, I have a thought here I'd like to share with you and see if you have some feedback for me. This is my belief, and I don't think it is necessarily, it's necessarily a modern problem. I don't think it's a Western problem. I don't think it's an American problem or a Midwestern problem. I think it's a people problem. But here's what I think I see, and maybe you'll share with me some of your thoughts on this. People want the benefit without the hardship. I think that that's a general statement that we would probably all agree with. And when I say people, I mean me. and you probably mean you. Because at our heart, we really do. We want the benefits, but we really don't want the hardship. We want wealth, but we don't want to work hard for it, save, do without, and not spend on the things we want to spend it on. We want healthy, strong bodies, but we want to be able to eat all of our sweets and fried foods and never go to a gym. We want really great friendships, but we don't want to put ourselves out there and be vulnerable and connect with people. We want great marriages, but we don't want to put in the kind of time and effort that it really takes to develop that. We want a lot of things, but we don't want what you have to go through to get those things. Now, assuming, since I'm seeing a lot of nods as I look across the room here, that you also agree with that, help me then in this statement. How does that relate to trust in God? If it's true that we want the benefits without the hardship, then how does that relate to the fact that we really want to trust in God? I'll hear your thoughts. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the silence is revealing there. Yeah. Okay. I like that a lot. That's a great example. That's an example from real life experience. That's an example of something you've gone through. There was a hardship. And that hardship and God's the way God came through in that is reason now that you can look back on those past hardships and look forward with trust. If you never had those hardships, which admittedly we don't want the hardships, but that hardship had a benefit. That trust that you have now developed is good. Good thought. Maurice. Yeah. Good. Right. Yeah, I like that. Maurice makes a good connection there between what James says about faith, faith, and works, faith and action. That the whole premise of our faith is that our faith ought to be demonstrable. Our faith ought to be evident in the actions. And if we're not willing to act on our faith, if we're not willing to put our faith into action, if we're not willing to really step out and live our faith, then the question comes, what's the value of that faith? And what are we really relying on God for? It's almost a sense in which I don't want to put forth any effort, but I do want God to step in and deliver and take care of and protect and provide and all the things that He's promised, but I don't really want to act upon that. And that same kind of thing can be put into a conversation about trust. I want to trust in God, but I really don't want to be put in positions where I have to. Roger.
God slapping me up the side of the head, and I can see where my life has changed since that particular event in my life.
Yeah.
Like I said, it took a slap up against the
Yeah.
head to get out of the hardship.
That's a perfect example of what I'm going for here, Roger. That's exactly right. It goes back to what Christy was saying. The whole idea of when we face hardships, when we're made to really grapple with big issues, mortality. We're made to grapple with these big concepts of life, and we find that God's there for us, and God has stepped in, and He's made a way, and He's provided. It really does. It gives us a whole new sense of trust. It gives us a whole new sense of what it means to trust God. I don't mean to be disparaging to us, but I think that the reality is we want to have the high level of trust that we know we can depend on God, that we feel that, we demonstrate that, we live in a constant sense of contentment, of confidence, of assurance, but we don't ever really want to have to weather the storms that provide us that. Calm harbors don't make great sailors. It's when we're in the storm that the lessons of life are learned. It's when the hardships are there that we see God at work. Speaking of storms, literally, Peter that sees Jesus walking across the water, and he steps out of the boat. He puts himself in a hardship so that he can learn this trust in God. That's the opposite of what most of us do. That's the opposite of what I do. I know that hardships are going to come enough, and when they do, I hope to gain trust in God from them. But to step into a hardship, to invite a hardship, and to know that God's going to be there, that God's going to come through for that, is a level of trust that I think is really profound. We understand that hardships provide means for God's intervention to be seen. It's in the dark night that the stars shine the most brightly. It's in the midst of our hardship. It's in those difficult times that we can really experience God's providential care for us. And when we have experienced that in our past, we can bring that forward into the momentary hardship that we're experiencing now. And we can say, I'm in this hardship, or I see one coming. I know there's something out there. There's a medical test that I'm waiting for that I'm nervous about. There's a financial pivot coming up in my life. There's a situation, there's a job change, there's a career change, there's a health scare, there's something that's coming up. How can I face that? Well, if I can go back and look at the hardships that God has brought me through, and I can bring that trust forward, and I can say, He's been there, He's proven Himself, then it gives us that opportunity. The other thing that we have as our advantage as Christians is that we have thousands of years of history of God demonstrating trustworthiness in times of hardship. Admiral Chester Nimitz is one of my favorite military leaders. He's a brilliant man. And he famously had a quote where he said, I know I learned from my mistakes, but I don't have time to make all the mistakes, so I'm going to try really hard to learn from your mistakes. I don't have time, nor do I want to experience all the hardship. But we have an entire Bible filled with men and women who have experienced hardship and have seen God come through in profound ways. What was true for them can be true for us, is true for us. God says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. And yesterday, and I mean that metaphorically, yesterday he was there for his people. He was there in times of challenge. He was there with Noah in the flood. He was there with Joseph in the pit. He was there with Joseph in the prison. He was there with Abraham being called to go to a place that I would show you. These stories that we've been looking at week after week, these characters that we brought back to our remembrance week after week, are men and women that have experienced hardship. And out of that hardship, they reestablished or developed or found a trust in God. And when we face hardships today, we're standing on a foundation that goes back thousands of years of evidence that says, I know who holds tomorrow. I know who's got me. I know who promises to be there. And whether it's a personal experience, Roger, sharing these personal experiences, whether it's the experiences that we can relate to from Scripture, it gives us confidence to be able to face the challenges that we have. Today we're going to be looking at a challenge that was being experienced by God's people. And we're going to see at varying degrees of success the trust that they showed in God. Sometimes they demonstrate great trust. Sometimes they don't. But in all of these stories, we have examples to learn from and an opportunity for us to examine our own lives and to consider the place that God has in our life and the kind of trust that we really do have in Him. I won't ask you to comment on this. I just plant this in the back of your mind as we go through this story. I just ask you to think about, as I've been thinking about this morning, what is my level of trust with God? To what extent do I demonstrate trust in Him? When I wake up in the middle of the night in a panic and can't go back to sleep, and I'm thinking about this thing out in the future, what's that say about the level of trust that I have in God? When I can't shake the nervousness that I have for a deadline, a date, a square on the calendar that has a big red circle around it, what's that say about the level of trust I have in God? What can I do to increase that trust? What can I do to develop the kind of trust that I truly want to have? We're going to start in chapter 1, Exodus chapter 1. Our first reading is going to start in verse 8. And we're going to be looking at the hardship that the people of Israel the Israelites were suffering under Egyptian bondage. Just to set the frame here, we all know where we've been to this point, but let me catch us up in case you need a refresher. We talked about Joseph. We talked about the way God worked in Joseph's life in amazing ways, brought him down into Egypt so that he would be in place to be able to save his family during a time of great famine. Not just his family, but the entire nation and the region, by putting away food and storing it up so that when the time of famine came, that there would be provisions for God's people and all the people of that area. God provided means by which Joseph's family came and reunited with him in Egypt. And they have become a great and prosperous people over the course of these many, many years that have transpired since those days. And we pick up our story today in verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. And they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. A little bit of historical aside, there are some historians that actually point to this story as a possible inspiration for some atrocities that we've seen closer to our own time. When Hitler was rising to power, he had grand plans that he outlined in Mein Kampf, the famous book that he wrote from prison. And in that book, he talked about how he wanted to make the Ukraine, the Caucasus, the steppe of Russia, the breadbasket. And his plan was to move in, take that land, and to set up farms and to work the Slavic people so hard that he literally worked them to death, eradicated the population, repopulated it with German families, and created a whole new race of people where there once was. And his goal was very clearly set out, that he wanted to feed them just enough to get a certain number of years of work out of them before they died. And that was his goal, to work them literally to death, to depopulate them through work. And some historians actually point back to this to say that wasn't a new idea. The Pharaoh that rose up after not knowing Joseph had a goal in mind to depopulate this people, to remove them by working them literally to death. It was an oppression. It was a horrible time of oppression. And what's interesting in this is that we see that the more they were oppressed, verse 12, the more they multiplied. The more they tried to oppress these people, the more God blessed them. Now at this point, God's doing so from sort of a veiled presence. He's not clearly making himself known to the people. He's not yet revealing his hand at work. But the simple dynamics of it are clear. A people who are becoming more and more oppressed don't naturally populate at a higher rate. They don't naturally thrive. So even though they were not aware of God's provision, God was working in their lives. You ever feel like that? Can you look back on times in your life that you clearly see now that God was at work, and in the moment you didn't see it? Times that just felt like oppression, you didn't see any relief, you didn't see anything getting better, but God was at work even in the midst of that. God was making means for you even in the midst of that hardship, even in the midst of that difficulty. While oppression was being felt in your life and your focus was on that, what you might not have been seeing was the way God was working in the background. Pick up the story from 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast in the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. As if the oppression wasn't bad enough, as if things weren't rough enough for the people in their slavery, in their oppression, in being worked literally to death, at least the attempt was made to work them to death. Now we have infanticide being introduced to the story. Interesting little thing I was reading about this Shiphrah and Puah. You know, by this point, we estimate that the Hebrew population in Egypt was hundreds of thousands. Some speculate there may have been 1 million or more at this point. How is it possible that there's only 2 midwives for hundreds of thousands of people? And so one possible explanation for this goes back to documentation that's been found historically, that midwives were a very organized group, that this was a highly regimented kind of profession. The women that did this were trained and were very specifically given skills to do this, as we would all agree is important. And because of that, they had structures of leadership. And probably what we have here, Shiphrah and Puah, are sort of the CEOs. They're the overseers of this whole huge group of women that do this. And so instead of calling hundreds and hundreds of midwives, the Pharaoh just called the leaders and said, this is what I expect you to tell all the midwives to do. And of course, they did not. We could get into a discussion, which we won't because of time, and Jim's going to keep me straight today, of making sure that we stay on time. We could get into a discussion about what they said here, that the Hebrew women are vigorous, that the Hebrew women give birth before they even get there. We always take that to be, well, that was them telling a lie, that they were lying to save those. And it very well could be that they were doing that. It's not the first time we see that happen. Rahab very famously lied to the guards who came looking for the spies, and later was commended for that in a really weird kind of twist. Is it possible that they were just flat out lying here? It's very possible. There's also some speculation that this is the kind of evidence that we see of God working behind the scenes. That this is the vigorousness, this is the vitality that these people were demonstrating, that even the midwives were like, this isn't normal. This isn't normal. It's not common for this to be taking place. And already, even though it's not evident to them, the hand of God is being made more and more aware. We look back on this and say, I can see God at work there. They didn't know that's what it was necessarily, but they were able to see God at work there. The fact is that we see that God was aware of the hardship. Even though they didn't know it, God was at work already. And now God's going to make his plan evident. There is always in God's provision that which is seen by the recipient of the grace and that which is unseen by the recipient of the grace. What is unseen by the recipient of the grace here is that the people have vitality, that they are vigorous, that they're multiplying, that they're able to endure under this hardship. What's about to be seen by the recipients of the grace is God's going to send a deliverer. God's going to visibly send someone that will help the people. Let's skip down to chapter 2 and let's pick it up in verse 23. Yeah, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Here's my contention. This wasn't God discovering it. This wasn't God saying, oh my goodness, I lost track of you guys for a while. Here you are. Man, things are tough. That's clearly not what's happening because God has already been at work. This is where God's going to move from the unseen grace to the seen grace. What he has been doing behind the scenes is now what he's going to do evident and out there for everyone to see. And that's going to come in the form of a deliverer named Moses. Chapter 3, skip down to verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. This is a pretty profound moment. Roger.
God has already told Isaac this very thing.
Yeah, he had, hadn't he? They'd already been to this land. They'd already been to the land that they were going to be promised. They'd already been there. They'd already been seeing it.
But when Isaac went down to Egypt, he told them, people will be oppressed, and I will
Deliver them out. Yeah. The prophecy has this beautiful multi-cyclical kind of fulfillment to it in many cases. You have these prophecies that, God speaks to Abraham in covenant. God speaks to Isaac in covenant. He talks about, I'm going to take you back to this land, Canaan. I'm going to take you out of this land, Egypt. And it just continues to cycle back. That's the whole idea of this covenant relationship that God has with his people and the promise that he continues to remind them of. That's why even today, when the rain goes away and the rainbow pops up in the sky, all of us look and go, I know what that is. I know what that is. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, we remember that because he renews his covenant. The visible reminders of his covenant are made new every generation and even every day. So God calls Moses. This scene in chapter 3 is, of course, the scene that takes place at the burning bush, the bush that was burning, but it wasn't burning up. Would have loved to have seen that to identify what that even was. The best thing I can speculate with that is that probably what we have is a healthy, vibrant bush that's green and verdant, and a light is shining out of it in a profoundly blinding way. That's at least the best understanding I can come from what the author there is trying to capture. But certainly it would have been something enormously curious for him to make a trek to it and to have it draw his attention. The conversation that he had there was even more spectacular than the bush itself, and the revelation that God had heard the cries of his people. God heard it. He saw what was going on, and he was stepping in to act. And of all people, Moses would be the vessel of his deliverance. That's a really amazing thing. Of course, we remember that Moses wasn't all that hip to the jive of this. Josh.
Yeah, speaking of Moses, I think his story is pretty interesting. In chapter 2, it talks about his birth and everything. But I had notes that I had written in my Bible that when he murdered that Egyptian and fled to Midian, he was 40 years old. And then at the time that the burning bush appeared, he's 80 years old.
Yeah.
So 40 years from, you think, what was God doing that whole 40-year time?
40.
He thought he was just going to be a shepherd the whole time. God still had a huge plan.
Yeah. Yeah. When you look at the timetable of these stories, it is profound. Remember when we talked about Noah? We talked about Noah, and it said that it was 100 years between the time that God said, I'm going to send a flood, and he sent the flood. 100 years. We talked about Abraham, and God said, I'm going to make you a father of many. And then he comes back 25 years later and goes, well, you don't have any kids yet. I'm going to up the ante and call you a father of many nations. And then it was years more. Well, it was 1 year more before he finally came through with that. Years and years and years transpire. Moses is 40. His whole life can be split into 40s, which is really an interesting thing. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, 40 years in the desert. But what was he thinking during that time? He had to be thinking, this is my life. This is what I am. I'm a foreigner. I'm a stranger in a strange land. It's just me and Zipporah, and we're going to hang out. This is all life is going to be. And God's timetable is not our timetable. God's timetable is not our timetable. And it's so hard for us to get our brains around that. It's so hard for us to do that. I've confessed to you before that waiting is not my game. Not my game. I still, when Scott McFarland was here, preaching back in October, he joked with me. He said, I went back and checked in the kitchen to see if you'd made lunch recently, because my lunches take 2 minutes to warm up. But he would always laugh that he would come in, the door is open, and there's like 30 seconds left on the timer, because I can't wait 2 whole minutes for my meal to get all the way warm. I'd rather eat it with an ice chunk in the middle of it than to stand there for 2 whole minutes. Patience is just not something a lot of us are good at. And these guys are waiting 100 years. They're waiting 25 years for a kid. They're waiting 40 years for God to show a plan. And then when they do start the trek across the wilderness, there's another big block of time. So the timetable makes a big difference. The other thing that's interesting about Moses is his hesitancy. His hesitancy. And when you think about the hesitancy of Moses, it's something that is pretty common through the pages of Scripture, isn't it? When God comes to somebody and says, you're the one I've chosen for something great, the common response is, you surely don't mean me. You surely don't mean me. Gabriel comes to Mary and says, you are going to have a son. You're going to name him Jesus. He will save the people from their sins. And she said, how can this be? Gabriel comes to Zechariah and says, you're going to have a son. You're going to name him John, and he's going to be the one to blaze the path for the Messiah. How can that be? Abraham, you're going to have a son, and he's going to be Isaac, and he's going to be the progeny around which I'll build my people. How can that be? So oftentimes what we see are God's people responding to God's invitation to do something great by looking at their own limitations. And that's typically what we do. What we typically do is God says, here is something I have for you. And we say, I can't do that because I'm looking in the mirror at what I bring to the table. I'm looking at what I can do. I'm looking at my limitations. I'm looking at my abilities. And based on what I am, I know I can't do that. And God is inviting us to do what He asked all these guys to do, which is to say, stop looking at yourself and look at the source that I provide. Look what I bring. Moses says, I'm not a good speaker. God's like, really? Who made your mouth? Who gave you that mouth? Do you not think that I did that? And if I gave you that and I called you for this, am I surely not going to make this work? I'm going to let that be the thing that Abraham, Sarah's too old. God's like, that's going to limit me? God's going to be up there wringing his hands? Oh my goodness, my plans are shot. Sarah's older than I thought. No, of course not.
So you started out this class by asking, really want to trust God? Why can't we trust God? The example you're giving there, and many other examples, is that these people had an intimate relationship with God. He spoke directly to them, and we would in turn say, well, yeah, if God told me, if I heard it direct from God, oh, I would be right there. I would wait 40 years for this and that to happen. But our faith is without being able to see.
Yeah.
It even mentions that blessed are those who never see.
And yet believe.
Our faith has to be much stronger because we don't have that intimate relationship of God speaking directly to us as he did in that age and era. But now our faith is required because without it we can't please God.
Yeah. Hey, Carl, that's such a great point, and I hope everybody was able to hear that. I'll try to restate that as best I can, but I won't catch your eloquence. The reality there is that we often do exactly that. We often think, well, if God had come to me himself, well, sure, if an angel appeared, well, yeah, I'd be able to believe. I would have trust if that happened. But we're called to have a faith that's not based on sight. We're called to have a faith that's based on a relationship that we have with God and be able to use the evidences that we have from those things that were written beforehand were written for your learning. They were written for us. They were written for us so that we would be able to have a faith that's not dependent on sight. And so it's really easy for us. I am the world's worst at finding myself being really critical of the children of Israel. I read through, I get so frustrated reading Exodus, reading Numbers, reading Deuteronomy. Well, partly because some of those are just really hard to read. But there's other times when I get really frustrated because I'm like, what did you have for breakfast? You walked out of your tent and you picked it up off the ground. People, what in the world are you doubting? What are you doubting? How can you doubt when every single day he puts blessings right smack dab in front of you? And then I have to think, Jeff, every single day he puts blessings right smack dab in front of you. Maybe I need to look a little more in the mirror there because I'm just as, I am guilty of being critical of others. And I do that, Carl. I say, well, if an angel would have spoke to me, if God would have spoke to me, then I would have greater trust. But even Peter, when he was writing about his time with Jesus, said, what we have in Scripture is more sure. Peter says, I walked with Jesus. I hung out with him for 3 years. And what you have in Scripture is even more sure than what I had in a personal experience. There is power in that, and there is power in that that I don't grasp and I don't take hold of like I should. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Moses felt reluctance. And I think that when we feel reluctance, we need to do just what Moses should have done and what I think he eventually did do, which is remember who it is that's calling. God's not going to call us to something that he's not going to provide us the means to be successful in. Now, here's where that becomes important. Because it's very easy for all of us to sit here and go, yeah, well, if God ever calls me to anything, if God ever puts something out in front of me, then boy, I really need to be ready to. Well, he has. He has put it out in front of us. He's put it out in front of us as clearly as he can possibly put it out in front of us. Go into all the world and teach the gospel to every living creature. He's put it out in front of us that we are plan A for the salvation of the people, for the evangelism of the people around us. We are the only means by which the world is ever going to see the light of Jesus Christ. And so for us to sit here and go, God, anytime you want to drop something here, I'm ready to get busy for you. He has. And the same kind of trust that we are saying Moses should have had, Abraham did have, that Noah demonstrated, is the same kind of faith and trust that we should be putting into practice for the things that God has already dropped in our lap. Over the course of the next, I got 3 minutes. Over the course of the next 6 chapters, we're going to see in quick succession 3 major events take place that I think are trust building for Moses, trust building for the people, but also are the basis on which the entire faith structure of the Hebrew people is going to be based. And that is the plagues leading up to the Passover, what God did to demonstrate his power, and then culminating that in the Passover event. All those different plagues, I wish we had time to get into it, I'll just say this quickly. It's very interesting when you go and you lay out side by side what the plagues were and the common religions of Egypt in that day. And almost one for one, they correlate. Almost every single plague is God saying, you have a God who does this, I do that better. You have a God that you believe, I do that better. He is systematically deconstructing everything the Egyptian people put their faith in and saying, you are putting your faith. Starts with the Nile. It turns the Nile to blood. The Nile was a god to them. The Nile was everything to them. The Nile provided them nourishment. It flooded their fields. It provided their moisture. It provided their harvest. Everything. The fish. They fished the Nile. Transportation. The Nile was everything to them. And God said, that's so great to you, I'll kill it like that. And you talk about, the frogs and the gnats, and all of these were symbols of their gods. And every single one, God's saying, I am the God. Not this silly stuff that you keep putting your trust in. And it all came into fruition with a singular event of the Passover. All of that done, the people of Egypt absolutely cannot deny that God is the God. And he institutes a practice for his people so that they would remember what he has done for them. That they would every year remember what he has done for them. We have a practice that every week we remember what he's done for us. The Passover symbolism between Christ and the Passover is just so incredibly rich. We could spend an entire quarter just looking at that. Second event was the crossing of the Red Sea. An absolutely impossible event. To be cornered, to think you got out, you made it out of Dodge, all's good, we're on the move, things are great, and then to have it all unravel so immediately, pinned between the Egyptian army and the sea. You've got no means by which to get through, and God opens through the hardship an opportunity for salvation, and then the destruction of the Egyptian army in that same sea. Yeah, they weren't going anywhere. Yeah, they were stuck. They were in a deep valley, and they could go forward, they could go backward, and neither one was a good option. Yeah, the destruction of the Egyptian army, and how it is that same sea that God opened up to provide a means of escape for his people became the means by which he destroyed his enemies. And look at the pattern that you have there of what we see in the New Testament. God demonstrating systematically that he is greater than all the constructs of human mind. What do we put our trust in? What do we rely on? What do we depend on? What do we turn to for confidence? And God says, I'm better than that, I'm better than that, I'm better than that. And let me give you something that you never forget, a Passover event, and I want you to reflect on it regularly so you never forget what I've done for you. And then I'm going to open up a means of salvation in a way that you can never expect. And that same means of salvation that saves you is ultimately going to be my victory over my enemies. In that same way, that same death on the cross that opened up the Red Sea for us to go through on dry ground is the same event that destroys his enemies and assures the victory that God has over all the satanic forces. It's an amazing story. And it's just replete with so many different images. We covered 2 of my 5 points this morning, but at least in those, I hope we made some good progress. And we got out on time, for once. Thanks so much, guys.